So we can actually instruct our hearts with our minds. And if it makes any sense, I think that's the motion of interpreting art. You start with the heart and the feeling, come up to the mind, and you study and you think and you look at other examples, and then you let that all come back down to the body, and you'll be surprised. You start feeling even more.
Create for No Reason is your weekly dose of inspiration to create what you believe should exist in the world. It's where passion meets craft, and we explore the joy of the creative process and building a meaningful body of work. I'm so excited about this episode because I was joined by Joseph Fasano. He is a poet, novelist, songwriter, and teacher. He has written 5 books of poetry and 2 novels. His honors include the Rattle Poetry Prize, the Cider Press Review Book Award, and the Worldview Prize from the Poetry Archive. He holds 2 degrees in philosophy and poetry from Harvard University and Columbia University. I absolutely loved my conversation with Joseph. We talked a little about his book, The Magic Words, which is how I originally found him. I picked up a copy of this book and I loved it so much. And then I found him on social media and asked him to join us on the show, which he kindly agreed to do. We talked about the book, we talked about poetry, we talked a little about the creative process. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Joseph Fasano. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Absolutely my pleasure. Absolutely.
I'm so excited about this conversation because I love poetry and I have gotten so much more into poetry over probably like the past 5 years or so. And I picked up your awesome book, The Magic Words, which I love the color and I love the cover, all the fun things. And so I'm excited to dig into just getting to know you a little bit more. And then, of course, to dig in a little bit more around poetry and some tips that you might be able to share with us to consume poetry differently and also to write poetry. So I'll start with, how did you get in? Well, we'll start with, what do you do?
It's a very hard question. No, I'm a writer. It's something that, as we can talk about, I didn't start my life thinking of myself as a writer. It was something that I always had a great love for reading and words. And I didn't come from an environment that really imagined writing as a possibility. So I had to give into it and find a way to make that happen in my life. But what I do now is I write and I teach, apart from being a father, which I'm very proud of. And so that's really how I spend my days. I try to write poetry. I write novels. I'm working on a memoir at the moment, and just trying to tell the truth.
Trying to tell the truth. Oh my gosh. So what novels are you working on?
So right now I'm working on a short novel that's kind of a hybrid text. It's somewhere between a novel and, I suppose one might say, self-help. It's a story I'm writing it for my son, and it's a little book about a man and a boy on a journey, and the man pauses at some instances to give his son some lessons. And of course, at the end of the book, he realizes that his son is teaching him something he never could have known.
Oh, how old's your son?
He's about to turn 3, so he's still a baby. But I love in my work kind of talking to him and imagining things that he might read in the future. And, any parent knows that you think you're teaching your kids, and they really are teaching you some wonderful, wonderful life lessons.
Ah, that's so beautiful. How does it feel? Well, you said you didn't think that you would be a writer, or like, I feel like when I meet writers that actually write for a living, like that is what they do, I feel like immediately it's this sense of glamorization, like, oh, you're a writer and you're in New York and you get to go to the coffee shop and you have your computer and you're just sitting and writing novels and poetry and it just feels so beautiful. But I know it's not always, does it? I'm sure that's not your day-to-day experience.
Yeah, no, ask my accountant. No, it's the kind of life, and I say this half jokingly. I don't think, if you really are committed to it, it's the kind of life I don't think anybody would choose. That's not to say it's not full of beauty and love and bliss, but It is difficult, and, so I think there's a way in which if you do it, it's because it's chosen you. I think a lot of artists will feel this in any medium, whether you're a painter or a songwriter. It's something you feel you absolutely have to do. The great poet Rilke writes in a letter somewhere to a young poet, just go into the silence and the darkness and ask yourself if you absolutely have to do this. And if the answer is yes, and then he goes on, and I'm paraphrasing these beautiful words, then, devote yourself to the beauty of that task. Um, and it's true. It's true.
That reminds me of, and I bring this up often. It reminds me of what comedians say, how comedians will say, "If you can do anything else, go do that."
It's true. There's another piece of that that's true that, I'm blessed in the sense that I happen to love teaching. And so I've made a living doing that as well. But yeah, it's a unique thing to do, especially in our culture. And our culture, it has these wonderful pockets of people who are deep readers and appreciate this kind of thing, but it's not really across the culture. When I travel around the world, and I'll give a poetry reading in Madrid, or my work will be translated into uh, pick a language. Recently, a novel of mine was translated into Lithuanian. There's a respect for the artist in a lot of these cultures, not seen as kind of a quirky, marginalized, strange thing, but rather as an essential part of a culture. And we don't have that really in in the United States. Uh, and so you've got to carve out a way to make it work. And there's pride in doing that
Why do you think that is?
because of the market.
Especially because there are so many people today who consider themselves artists because we have access. We're creating videos and writing, and people are putting so much content into the world. Why do you feel like it's so different in different countries?
Because in a society that values money above all else, it's very hard to find those spaces that really value things that are not designed for the product, but more for the process. So writing is very much about, you're never going to write the final book that says it all. It's all a dynamic process of becoming. And our culture very much values product. What do you have? What do you have to sell? What's the final thing? What's your brand as an individual? Whereas an artist shouldn't be a brand. An artist should be a dynamic, becoming. And there are some people who have been able to do it, and that's wonderful. You look at somebody like Bob Dylan, who's now, he didn't need any resurgence, but he's even having a bigger one now because of the film that's come out recently. There's somebody who has figured out how to be a real artist in the public sphere. The moment marketers get their hand on what he's doing, he goes and does something else and follows his heart, follows his soul, and finds a way. So as long as artists keep creating audiences rather than audiences shaping artists, and having, like a pre-made product that's necessary, I'm not casting aspersions on the society that we have. There are wonderful places for artists to grow. You just have to really be mindful about how you do it.
Yeah, I remember I heard somebody was talking about how writers that write, how there's some authors that they just churn out.
Mhm.
They have like hundreds of books.
Right.
And it at some point gets to the place where they have the formula, they figured out the formula that works, and now they can just create and write all these books, but that they've kind of lost the passion of the writing because it's now just so formulaic instead of really venturing out into what they really wanna write about or talk about or structure things differently, and I never really thought about it in that way.
Yeah, those aren't writers. Those are business people. And that's not literature. Look, those people are going to be replaced anyway because AI can do that. AI can fill in a formula and write something of a kind. Um, I think it was T.S. Eliot who said somewhere, you only figure out how to write the thing you no longer want to write. In other words, you're always moving into new territory. You should always be, if you're a writer working on a book, you have no idea how to write, and
Ooh,
uh,
really?
Yeah, absolutely. If you know how to do it, then you shouldn't be doing it.
I love so much that you say that because I was gonna ask you this question. So I wrote my first book. It came out last year or 2 years? Oh my gosh, time. I don't know.
Congratulations, though.
Thank you. It was such an interesting process, and I knew that it was gonna be challenging, but I learned so much, and I also got really I geeked out on the creative process and the writing process, so I started reading all these books about writing and got really just entrenched in all those ideas of how people create their best work. So I'm thinking about all these ideas of the next book that I wanna write. And Joseph, I have so many ideas, but there's this one idea that I've been really playing around with, and I have no idea how to write it. In fact, I was telling a friend of mine the other day, I said, "I don't even know if I'm the right person to write the book. I don't know if I can write it in a way that people would consume." I know the message is important, but I don't know if I can deliver the message in a way that would impact people. And so I'm just going all over it. But you know what? I kind of yelled at myself the other day because what I'm not doing enough of is writing it out, like
Yeah.
trying to figure out what that would be because I'm so stuck on, but I don't have the outline. I don't know what it's going to look like or be.
All of these are reasons you should do it. But it's so true. I mean, right now I'm working on a memoir. And of course, I've always been a reader of memoir and I love nonfiction and one studies it, but I've never written one. And it's a wonderful, terrible process of how do I do this? What even is this? And it was that way when I wrote my first novel years ago. Uh, you know, Poetry has always been my first love, and I've always, there's a part of it I just kind of can feel like I can breathe that. But even a lifelong reader of novels, student of literature, you sit down to write it, and you're like, well, what does it mean for me to write a novel? Um, so I think that's true. I think you should definitely have a sense that you don't really know how this is going to take shape, where it's going to go. And only then will you have the surprise that the reader will feel as well.
Mm. Do you have a writing process? Like, what is your writing process when you think of
So
an idea and then you're, "Okay, I'm gonna sit down and get this done."
so yes, it varies for the different genres I'm working on. Speaking of novels, and I guess I'm just finished my third, but what I've done in every instance is an idea will come to me. And usually the idea is a little bit vague. It's more a sense of character. I hear a voice, characters that are speaking with one another. And I tend to, if my life permits it, I tend to say, okay, I really need to get into this world. And I'll do my world building and my writing and my pre writing. And I'll really put in long, long days for a couple months. And I tend to draft a shape of the book, I suppose, relatively quickly, over a couple months, let's say, maybe half a year. And then the process will be read it, listen to it. What is it really trying to become? And then shape and revise and revise. When it comes to poetry, very often that's uh, an image, a scrap of music, something that'll come to me. And I'm always carrying around notebooks and I'll jot down. Sometimes a poem will come more or less fully formed, but those are rare, blessed moments. And so you'll shape something. And I think the poetic imagination is a synthetic imagination. So you'll say to yourself, you're driving one day on a trip and you got a line in your head. Oh, that's where this fragment that I wrote 3 or 4 years ago needs to belong. And they tend to click, they tend to come together. And I think you need to live your life and be in your life and experience things. And, lyric poems have a way of coalescing around those experiences.
When it comes to poetry, how do you write poems that don't sound trite,
Yeah.
generic? I feel like I just think it's when I read a great poem, it really grabs you and moves you, and then you read something else and it's pretty, but the language just feels different.
Yeah, I don't yeah, I think poems probably should never be pretty because they should be Rilke says that every angel is terrifying. In other words, real beauty is gonna shake you in a way. Um, you know, one way to answer that question would be to say that you have to go deeply into the particular. I have this saying that I say to my students, and it's half a joke because I don't mean it literally. When they're writing their poems, I say, "Okay, you've written your poem, your first draft of it. Now I want you to ask yourself the question, what does it smell like?" And they look at me like, "This man is crazy." And I say, what I mean there is, does it have the particular sensations of if you're writing about grief, is there an empty chair in it? Is there the scent of old linens in the room? If you're writing about love, is the sea crashing into your poem? Where are the particular images that unlock the universal experiences that we have? Because that's true. We don't want to read a poem often that's just aphoristic or general, or it feels like it could be replaced by any other piece. We want to read something that's about real experience of living. And I think as a writer, if you can go deeply into that, then you can trust your imaginative process.
So how can someone like me
Yeah.
who wants to get better at poetry, how well, first of all, how do you find your voice? Like, do you feel like people have a particular voice in their poems?
Yes, I do. I do think so. And I think, it of course changes over time in a life, but the essence of a being is very much there. Robert Frost used to say a poet's tone is really their identity because your tone is your stance toward the world. Are you acerbic? Are you ironic? Are you earnest? That tends to relatively stay the same over a life. And, in terms of people breaking into to writing, if they feel really drawn to poetry, I mean, obviously, the first thing is just to consume as much of it as you can and to read across the board, different eras, different traditions. Read things in translation if you don't have other languages. And this is why also, I wrote this book, The Magic Words, because that grew out of my work with children. There are a lot of people who want to experience, letting a poem move through them, but of course don't have the sense of structure or how to do it. And the thing about that book is what it does is it tries to bypass the conscious mind. It gives you a structure to write about, say, grief or love or anything in between, and to let images come up, to be writing about grief and to not worry about saying some grand statement, but to let these images speak. And I think that's a great way to start thinking about poetry.
So, yes, let's talk a little bit about the book because it does help people. So, I didn't know when I got it, I really didn't know what it was. I just liked it.
Well,
I was
that's
like,
a good start.
yeah, I was like, I don't know, the cover looks cool. It's simple poetry prompts. I love a good prompt. Let's just see what it is. But the way that you structured it, it is you have a specific like breakups or change or spring. And then you actually give people, it's not just prompts. Like I thought it was just going to be prompts. This is actually you're outlining a poem for
Yep,
them.
yep.
It was like what was that? Mad Libs, like a Mad
Yeah,
Lib thing, like
yeah.
when we were kids. And so I thought, and then I love that you included some example poems from what I assume are your students or people who have.
Yeah, there are people from around the world. I mean, one of the you're absolutely right. So for those who are listening, if they're not familiar with it, the prompts are very much an outline that has blank spaces in it. And those blank spaces are designed to be in places where the individual consciousness or unconscious that's writing the poem is going to bring up something unique. So, these pieces that people end up writing and they send them to me or email them to me or I see them online, even two people using very much the same prompt, what's created is so radically different. That I think is so powerful. And I think what it does, it helps people kind of break the barrier of the blank page and sort of say, a lot of people will start saying, well, most of these words are Fasano's on the page. This isn't mine. And then when they've written it, they say, this is my poem. And I love that. because it feels like theirs because there is such a uniqueness of the content that's come through. So it's a bridge. It's a bridge between writer's block or sometimes blocks that come into our lives because of trauma. Um, and it's a bridge to finding your own voice and finding your own words. And I have to say, I'm astonished by how it's been helping people around the world. It started in such a modest way of me visiting children in a classroom. And the fact that it's extended to people of all ages, um, neurodivergent people using it in ways that have allowed them to unfold. It's really been a wonderful blessing to see that happen.
Well, thank you for putting it out into the world because we need more poetry. We need
Yeah,
more poetry in the world.
I know, and I have to thank my team at Tarcher Penguin Random House, Mary and Lizzie, and others who reached out to me when they saw these prompts around the internet and said, "Look, there's really something here that could help a lot of people if we could, put it in the covers of between the covers of a book." And so I'm so happy with that. And they lend themselves to translation in other languages, and that's been amazing too. To see people around the world, it helps us see just how universal these images and these, of course, experiences are.
Yeah.
And if we can, what else is art but not, that effort to find that commonality.
Yeah. Oh, okay. What do you have a favorite poet? Like, who do you consume? Who do you love?
So I tend to read really all around the whole spectrum and historically, and I would say there have been poets for me that have been favorites through the years, but they change very often. So I've mentioned, for example, Rilke, tremendous poet, and survives the translations into English and very beautiful in the original uh, German as well. But there are times in my life when I'll say, um, what can a poet give me or teach me? So there's a wonderful a poet named Frank Stanford who died in the 70s, Southern American poet, from whom I learned a lot about, how to use images, in poetry. You go to poets in other cultures who have done some of that profound work with imagery. Thomas Transtromer, for example, comes to mind, who won the Pulitzer Prize. Spanish language poets always seem to know how to engage the body in the beautiful way. So I love poets like Lorca, Neruda, Vallejo, and there are so many great poets writing now, and even poets who are working today. I mean, just one that comes to the top of my mind is Ilya Kaminsky, who writes beautiful, beautiful poetry. So whether you're reading, the ancient poets and Horace and Catullus, or you're reading someone who just published something in a literary magazine yesterday, they all have something very unique, to teach us. There's a lot of poetry being published this day, and today, and that's a very good thing. Uh, but I think people should be encouraged to find the things that are online. Of course, I have a big online presence, so I don't want people to, avoid that. But use that as a gateway drug, and then go back into the library, go into the God forbid the canon, and find these voices. Go, read Gerard Manley Hopkins, for example, this phenomenal poet whose work is not going to be tremendously popular on Instagram, for example, but who can just awaken whole worlds in you. So let it be an unfolding.
Well, this is where you come in because you have such a great following and you're introducing people to different poems and different ways to use poems and write poems and read and find and discover new artists, which is beautiful. I recently, I think 2 years ago, I found William Seagard, his poetry pharmacy,
Oh, yes,
and
right,
he
yes.
has that. And then I didn't realize he has more. So he also has like a few different ones and it's just collections of different poets. So that's how I've been introduced to some other people's work that, to your point, I wouldn't have found otherwise.
I think it's so true, and I think, it's one of the reasons why I've done a couple programs online. During the pandemic, I started something called the Poem for You series, which grew out of just people missing that human connection and that human voice. And it was a series in which people would write in and they say, "Hey, look, I'd really love somebody to read." Sometimes they'd have a particular request, this poem my mother used to read to me, or sometimes they'd just say, "I need a poem about grief." And I got together a wonderful network of poets and writers and actors, and we would just read poems for people.
Oh,
And so it was a wonderful project. And then I developed a daily poetry thread. I'm kind of tapering off a little bit now, but I did that for about 3 years, in which every day I would post sort of a poem organized around a theme. And I would ask people, post any poem they like around that theme. And it would build these little daily anthologies. And I firmly believe, yes, that social media can be a great window for people into these worlds, deeper into these worlds of poetry, where they might discover something. And, you know, I don't know, the universe has a way of putting things in front of you when you need them.
yes. That is very true. Do you have a favorite poem?
I don't think I would say I have a favorite poem, but um, there's uh, many poems that have been on my mind lately. And there's a great poem called "The Cold Heaven" by Yeats, which is not the most uplifting poem, but Yeats was a great poet who allowed himself to have these visions, a very visionary poet. And in this poem, "The Cold Heaven," he imagines what happens to the spirit after death. I'll also mention that I am a profound admirer of T.S. Eliot's late masterpiece, Four Quartets, in which he really tries to. I mean, this is somebody who wrote The Wasteland, a great vision of the shattered modern world. This is a poem in which he tries to put the pieces back together and imagine a world of psychological healing and frankly, faith, which I think we don't have a whole lot of in a genuine way in our world today.
Mm. A couple weeks ago, I just saw they're touring, the Screw Tape Letters.
Okay.
Have you ever read that?
Yeah.
I didn't even know it's a play, I mean, essentially, it's a play, it's like
Where
a
where did you see it?
in Fort Lauderdale, it was at the Parker Playhouse,
Oh,
and so they're touring around it, it's amazing, and it's crazy how I mean, it's basically a two-person show, but this guy, can you imagine? He basically it's like a basically a monologue because he
yeah.
has to remember all the letters, it's wild, but it's awesome. Anyway, but that reminds me of that, so I'm gonna check out those poems for sure. I wanna know, Joseph, how do you interpret poetry? Because I will sometimes listen to podcasts where they're dissecting a poem, and as I'm listening, I'm thinking, "How how do they do that?" Like, I read the poem, but how do you interpret it and really understand what the poet was trying to go for?
Well, I think there are 2 things to that, and I often tell these to my students. The first thing is to let go of the notion of trying to decipher what the poet was trying to go for. That is to say that, there's a fallacy in imagining that everything that exists in a work of literature had to exist consciously in the writer's mind. So, the same way you could say something in a conversation to a friend and they point out, "Hey, you notice you've been sort of stuck on this theme," and you might say, "Oh, that's been subconscious in my mind." The poet also, and the artist in general allows things to come up from the subconscious that he might not be entirely conscious of. So, analysis of a piece is analysis of what's going on, not necessarily connected to the intention of the artist. Beyond that, I always tell my students, you've got to feel it first. So, you don't start with the head, you don't start with the cerebral thing. It would be like, sitting on a beach with someone you're in love with, and you're both looking at the sunset. And instead of feeling it, the first thing you try to do is say what it means. You're never really going to be in the experience. So you've got to start with those visceral reactions to the piece. Is there an image that strikes you? Does something make you, call you back to childhood, make you want to sob, make you want to leap up and for joy? Start with the feeling and then let the feeling come up toward the head and start thinking, okay, you know what? And of course, that comes with study, right? One of the things we forget is that there's not this dichotomy between just feeling and think. Let me make the analogy to painting, or let me make the analogy to music. Let's say you could sit down at the end of a long day and you put on some classical music station and Mozart is there and you're moved by it. Maybe you know nothing about music, but you're moved by it. Okay. So you're letting your body just experience it. But then you decide to take a class on music structure, like, oh, this is interesting what a sonata is and what it typically does. So now you're in your head. Then after that, you let all those things trickle back down to your heart and you listen to the same Mozart piece, and you'll be surprised you can actually feel more things than you might not have felt before. Because now you might be feeling the fact that he varied from an expected direction. So we can actually instruct our hearts with our minds. And if it makes any sense, I think that's the motion of interpreting art. You start with the heart and the feeling, come up to the mind and you study and you think and you look at other examples, and then you let that all come back down to the body, and you'll be surprised you start feeling even more.
Ooh. Is there such thing as a bad poem, Joseph?
Absolutely.
What?
Absolutely. I mean, and by bad, uh, and we've all been guilty of making them. There's so many bad. A writer has a million things that are trash, and some of them unfortunately get published. But and none of us are exempt from that. But I think by bad, one thing you can mean by that is of course trite, or it's been said before. But another thing is that you weren't honest with the process. You maybe tried to muscle the piece into a certain direction when it really wanted to unfold in another way. And that's one way of failing as a writer on a given day. It's where does the work want to go? Where does the novel want to go? Where does the poem want to go? Whether that's opposed to where you think it needs to go or where you need to force it. And when you force something, it's not going to be effective for the reader.
Bad poetry isn't honest. I love that.
Although a lot of honest poetry is bad.
Well, wait,
You know, it's about craft. It's about craft because craft is not just an afterthought. And I said this before, I keep saying this is my big theme lately. We live in a world of false dichotomies, so now it's like poetry is either self consciously obscure, sort of hiding from the heart, academic in nature, or just my feelings I'm going to post on Instagram. No, there's a great thing in the middle, which is poetry that's committed to to a craft that is so competent that it becomes transparent. The reader doesn't need to know, just as I said in the example of Mozart, the reader doesn't need to know sonata structure. The reader doesn't need to know these things, but can feel what the poem is doing. So I think you have to really work hard at mastering some aspects of craft, rhythm, all these aspects, but to write in a way that's meant to be felt, meant to be experienced, and dare I say, meant to be understood in however many meanings might be carried in that understanding.
is there a piece of your work that you're most proud of?
That's a really good question. There are, as I try to put together a volume of my selected poems now, where I'm selecting from my volumes, I do look at certain things that I feel maybe were more successful than others. But it really is going back and looking at the journey and seeing that things are different. So I wrote a book in about 2015, which is not really very. We got some media coverage in the day, but it's not really, I don't think, much read nowadays. But I'm very proud of it. It's a book called Vincent, and it's a book that's a dramatic monologue in the voice of a man who has had a psychotic break, and in that place has done something he's really, really ashamed of. And so that was a book that went really deep into the kind of dark side of the human consciousness. Uh, and then after that, I might write something that is more in the sunlight, as it were. So I don't think anything stands out as, this is, and I hope it never does. I hope I never say, this is the thing I always wanted to write, because then you're done.
I don't think that could ever happen.
I don't think so, unless you're fooling yourself.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever met an author who doesn't even say, "Oh my gosh, my first book, for I would have changed this. Why did I approach it that way? I think about it very differently." That's why I think some people they update versions of the book. And there's what's that quote? Um, "Art is never finished, it's only abandoned."
Abandoned, yeah, that's, Paul Valery said that.
Ah,
I love that. I
I
love
love
that.
that too. There's a couple of things in the book that I wanted to ask you about. You said in one of the sections, it's notes from me, and this is you're guiding people to share notes to themselves. You said the best teachers help us become our own teachers, our own sages, and our own guides. And then you ask people to write down notes from you, like what are some bits of wisdom. So, Joseph, what are some bits of wisdom that you would say to you that we can benefit from?
Well, it's funny that you say that because I just reshared on social media the other day when some years ago, a group of my students del- presented to me at the end of the semester of teaching a very funny little book in which they'd written down some of the more bizarre things that I had said over the course of the semester. And it was very funny. Of course, some of them were out of context. Um, and one of those things was, I think I had said, who taught you that wonder, love, and learning were supposed to be easy? And I think that there's a part of me that always likes to remind myself, it's okay. Things are hard. It's okay. If it's hard, it's often the exact thing that you should be doing. And the other thing that I've learned over time that I really keep coming back to as I'm writing my memoir is I think a lot about fear and what you seem to be afraid of in life. And I've said to myself, if you're afraid of something, try to think about what the opposite of that thing is. And chances are that's what you're really afraid of. So in other words, might get a thought in your head, really afraid I'm going to fail or I'm going to not be able to write this book. Think of what the opposite of that fear is. What if the fear is that you're afraid you're going to be able to write it? You're afraid you're going to say these things. It's going to really be out there and it's people are going to read it. And I find that little principle of inversion really helpful to get past some of those barriers that I put up for myself.
Interesting. I love that. What is the opposite of fear? You also invite people to you give them an assignment. Your assignment tonight is to read a writer someone told you not to. And I thought, I don't even know if anyone's told me not to read an author. So I was like, what is there an author that someone has told you not to read?
Well, maybe you're not spending enough time in the undergraduate institutions nowadays.
That could, yes, true.
Yeah, of course. I mean, sometimes it doesn't come out as clearly as that, but there's a lot of writers that, because of their lamentable personal lives or things that political views, that sort of thing. It's a very complicated conversation and a very tricky one. But there are going to be people who kind of suggest that you steer away from something. It might not be explicit as, thou shalt not read this person. But yeah, maybe it's just as simple as somebody who's not fashionable, somebody who's gone out of fashion, somebody whose work doesn't seem to resonate with the current zeitgeist. And go into that, explore. It might not be anything worth reading. It might not be something you like, but um, we can't all, just be reading the same things and just be thinking the same thoughts and just be having the same feelings. Because that's not natural. That's not what it is to be human. So follow that little voice in you that plays devil's advocate. you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I got into poetry so much is because I've been in the personal development space for a long time, and so I feel like I've read all the books, like, all the personal development. I've read tons of nonfiction books, and I was just digging into it, and they're all great in their own ways, but there's only so many ways in which you can talk about some of these things and some of these ideas, and so breaking out and I over the past few years, I've gotten more into reading fiction books because I used to be like, fiction books are a waste of time. I'm not learning anything. I'm not growing. And now I've come to really enjoy fiction books and just getting into different genres and learning more about, I mean, even the creative process and learning about the craft of writing or creating anything. Do you have any, are there any craft books that you have enjoyed or you enjoy?
Well, one that I always actually in particular when it comes to poetry, I recommend this book all the time to people, and it's a book called The Making of a Poem, and it was edited by Mark Strand, who was a former teacher and later friend of mine, just a great poet and a great writer, and Avon Boland, who was, I didn't know her personally, but was also, of course, just an amazing poet. She's written some of my favorite poems. And this is a book that serves as a guide into different poetic forms. It doesn't go too in depth, but it might say, okay, here's a chapter on the sonnet. What is it? What is the general shape of it? What's the history of it? And then it'll serve as an anthology. It'll give, 10 or 12 great sonnets from across the, history of Western literature. And then it'll say, the next form, a villanelle or a pantoum, and then it expands, it gets a little more open-ended. And it's a great one. It's a great one because it really can be an inspiration and it can also be a nice little introductory education. So those who are interested in learning a bit more about poetry and particularly forms in poetry, that's a great one.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I will pick it up
All
because
right.
I have too many. I'm addicted to books. I just have too many, but I will forever just love books in my,
There's no such thing as too many,
I know.
except as far as one's wallet is concerned.
Oh my gosh. I know. I know. All right, Joseph, I was going to ask you this and you don't have to do it, but I thought it could be kind of fun. So I do the past 2 years, I did the poem a day. You know how it's Writer's Digest, I think they do a poem a day for National Poetry Month. Anyway, so I started doing that 2 years ago and I'm planning on doing it again this year. So I have some poems and I thought, oh, maybe I'll share a short poem with Joseph and you can give me some critique on it.
Okay, I like that.
All right, we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Let's
But
see how it
you
goes.
can be brutally honest. And I just kind of selected one that I like and it's short. All right, you ready?
Yeah.
All right. Looking for a love story like one found only in dreams, dancing above the ocean, glitter falling out of stars, while an orchestra plays behind the moon, inviting us to sip from champagne waterfalls, flowing with song lyrics and poems from unknown artists, pulling me close, kisses tasting like cotton candy. His face is a shadow I've never seen, but have known forever.
Now, who wrote this poem?
I did.
You did. I think there's a lot of promise in it. I think, what we were talking about before is you got to go into a draft like that and find the strong moments. And I think the strong moments are images, right? An
Mm.
orchestra playing behind the moon. That's a beautiful, evocative image. And one thing I always say to myself and my students is say, okay, well, let me phrase it this way. The great poet Elizabeth Bishop used to say, okay, you have to build the bridge between yourself and the poem. And that's sort of like what's going on in the poem. How am I getting my feelings out on the page? Then you build a bridge between the poem and the reader. And she said, then you dismantle the first bridge. Now, what does she mean by that? What she means is when you read a poem like that and the word he comes up in your mind, you're still on the bridge between yourself and the poem. Like there's something there specifically. Who is that he or what does it evoke in you? But now you have to remember the reader doesn't have any of that information. And so when we get to a poem is not meant to just be like an oniric evocation. There has to be that specificity. So in that particular case, you're going to look at the poem and say, if I had a draft like that, I would say, literally, who is the he? Who is the other? What is the specific, palpable, dynamic relationship, in the poem? And you want to try to bring into it more of that specificity, more of that, real depth, even of narrative a little bit more, and then you start getting poems that think of the radical ways, and a poem comes to mind by Stanley Kunitz that begins, this is just an example, but it begins, "My mother never forgave my father for killing himself." Like that grabs our attention. I mean, it's powerful. You don't have to write in a narrative mode, but I think you need to ask yourself, what's the urgency? Why does this thing need to exist? And if instead we don't have that yet, and it becomes a series of impressions that are not yet orbiting around this black hole of profound gravity and depth. You never have to even mention what it is if the poem doesn't want to, but it needs to ask itself, what's the emotionally urgent core of it? And I would take that and, you look at your poems and you listen to them. You say, what is this he that came up? What is this? Where's the core of my poem? I might not be able to say it explicitly, but what's really the urgency there? So that's what I would say in all honesty, that it's something I do with my own work too. I don't know if that's helpful.
That is helpful. I'm jotting down notes.
I see you become very diligent. I love it. I'm humbled because I do it for myself too. Everybody, it all comes out, the words come out. But then the question is, what's the process? How do I sift this out? What's really at stake here? Because there's a difference between mystery and vague. We want mystery. What's more mysterious than anything? The pen that I'm holding in my hand is mysterious, but vagueness is not what we want in a poem. We don't want just suggestiveness, not really knowing what's urgently at stake. So you got to risk nakedness and trust that it's mysterious enough if you can give it the craft to really sing.
Yes. Oh my gosh. All right. And you do workshops, correct?
I do. As a matter of fact, I'm glad you've mentioned because I was talking about undergraduate institutions and I've been privileged and had a lot of fun teaching for almost 20 years, but I'm finding myself really enjoying, when I'll open up a workshop or even a seminar or a lecture, sometimes I'll do on the weekends online. I'm finding that they're just so enjoyable to work with people who really, really want to be there. And there's intellectual freedom and you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And recently I've sort of started my own academy and I'm planning on giving that a launch on June 1st of this year. And I'll be announcing classes, a lot of classes I've taught at my universities before, and going to be doing more individual work with clients and writers. I'm just really excited about that stage of my life.
Oh, well, I'm excited for you and I'm excited for me because I'll sign up for a workshop
There
you
you
have
go. Yeah.
because I know for me, it's one thing sitting and writing all these, and that's what I love about the poem a day with the challenge is that I get to read other people's work and the prompt is one thing and everybody's work is vastly different and it's so exciting. But my next step is really, I do want more feedback. I want to have
Yeah.
conversations with people that are doing the work and helping me get better because I know continually writing is great, but getting feedback, you need that feedback in order to really improve. All right, Joseph, I'm going to let you go. But before I do, I always ask all of my guests at the end, what is one activity that the listeners can do in 10 minutes or less to live a more creative and fulfilling life?
I love that question. And I'm going to answer it by saying what might seem the opposite of an activity, which is to practice stillness and silence very mindfully. And for different people, that has different, some people will do meditation. I do something called centering prayer to put yourself in a position of receptivity, vulnerability, listening, even if it's just listening to your own heart, but get in that state of turning down the volume. Because I think only when you're in that state can you hear the things that really want to be heard that are outside of the noise, the things that are coming in the culture wars, all these things that have their own significance. Practice some stillness, some silence, and see what voices you can hear.
Beautiful. I love that. Joseph, it was such a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you again for coming on the show. This has been such a fun treat to talk to someone who does this for a living and is so into poetry. And I appreciate your feedback on my poem.
I had a lot of fun, and I'm really glad you invited me and look forward to chatting.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I had so much fun getting to chat with Joseph. I love talking about poetry. And I also love that he was kind enough to listen to one of my poems and give me some feedback. That was awesome. So that was cool that we had that opportunity to do that. I hope there was something in this conversation that sparked your creativity, that has inspired you to go out. And he shared a lot of different authors, a lot of different poets that we can find and explore. So I hope you took some notes, and I hope this episode inspired you in some way to maybe dig into poetry a little bit more. Joseph shared a lot of really great resources. He shared lots of poets and authors and some books that we can dig into to uncover more about poetry and really just to feel. Like that came up a couple of different times during the conversation, this idea that poems, they connect people and they also help us feel more deeply. And when we're writing poems, I love the advice that he was sharing around how to write a poem and how it really does mean that we have to live a life and then take these feelings that we have or these experiences, and how do we write them in a way that is going to resonate with other people that have gone through something similar or just needs to hear the words that you want to put out into the world. I hope you discovered something about yourself, and I hope that you are inspired to start reading more poetry. I also encourage you to check out Joseph's book, The Magic Words, along with some of his other poetry books and novels. I'm going to leave his information below so you can check him out on Instagram, and hey, maybe I'll see you in one of his workshops. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. And until next time, go create something.